Hello and welcome to Stairway to Heaven, the show where you choose the tunes you'd spend eternity with. I'm Josh Hodgson.
And I'm Charlotte Clarke. Today's guest is the Liberal Democrat candidate for the Winchester area, Martin Tod.
He narrowly missed out on the Winchester seat to Conservative MP Steve Bryan earlier this year. He has spent the last few years working hard to improve the Winchester area. One keen area of interest is in housing and homelessness. He's a regular volunteer at the Winchester Night Shelter, which has recently received notice of further funding cuts.
The shelter is already suffering after major cuts of £6,000 in 2008. Martin, how do you feel about these cuts when £2 million has just been invested in a revamping of Winchester High Street?
Well, believe it or not, the first campaign I ran after I was selected as the parliamentary candidate for the Lib Dem, this was back in 2006, was to get the High Street repaved because so many people were tripping up and it was actually starting to be quite a big problem up at Accident and Emergency. A lot of elderly people were falling over because the quality of the High Street was so bad. And it definitely needed doing. I mean, it's the kind of thing you need to do every few decades or so to make sure you've got a decent high street. So I don't have a problem with that, and I don't really see it as a trade-off, one budget versus another. I do have a problem with some of the cuts that are being made. We are in a bit of a financial mess, but I still think there's different priority decisions that could have been made in a few cases.
Such as?
Well, there's a huge, great discussion. I think the banks have still being let off quite lightly. So I think, for example, we could be taxing them more, and we also need to look at a tax on wealth.
In terms of your involvement with charities that help the homeless, we hear you've just been appointed to a senior position at Shelter in London. Could you tell us a little bit more about the charity and what this new job entails?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I was very involved in Winchester with local charities. So there are about 4 homelessness charities in Winchester. I'm involved with 2 of them, the Night Shelter and Trinity Day Centre. Shelter in London is the national charity for housing and homelessness. It campaigns against homelessness, it campaigns to improve the quality of housing, the amount of housing available, particularly affordable housing. And vision is that everybody has access to a decent, affordable home to live in. The job I'm doing there, I'm Deputy Director of Communications, Policy and Campaigns. So recently, particularly with the government's comprehensive spending review, there have been big cuts in spending on social housing and big cuts in housing benefit, and so I've been very involved in campaigning against those and highlighting some of the consequences there'll be for people.
Do you enjoy it? Do you feel like you get something?
Oh, very much so. Yeah, very much so. It's very rewarding, and it's been an absolutely amazing time to join, because literally as I joined, we started to hear about all these cuts in housing benefit and the cuts in spending on social housing, and so it's been a very, very intense period where we've been campaigning against that.
So have you seen an increase in the amount of people coming to the charity?
We've certainly seen a very big response to our campaigns on them.
So your first chosen track is an absolute classic. It's Jerry Lee Lewis with Great Balls of Fire. So could you give us the story behind this choice?
Yeah, this isn't actually the normal version that you hear if you listen to Great Balls of Fire. It was on one of these rubbish compilation albums, made of plastic, that I can't remember, got probably at around 8 or 9, and I remember hearing this and thinking it was, absolutely amazing track, and really liked it, and been quite a fan of Jerry Lee Lewis ever since, and I went to see him in Brighton and stuff like that. But what I didn't realise, and I only discovered this about 3 years ago, is I'd heard about this album called Jerry Lee Lewis Live at the Star Club. Now, he ended up having quite a complicated and controversial private life, and he was doing this tour around Europe, and he ended up playing at the Star Club in Hamburg. And this has been described by many people as the greatest live rock and roll live album ever, because there's so much kind of anger and passion and whatever in it. And I had no idea that I'd actually heard some of the tracks from this before, back when I was 8 years old. They hadn't used the standard recording, which was the one he released to the charts. They'd used this recording of Jerry Lee Lewis live at the Star Club. And so it sort of takes me back to my childhood.
So we hear you're involved with the 1984 student protests against tuition fees. After yesterday's protest, could you tell us your thoughts on these 2 marches?
Yeah, I mean, I was actually abroad yesterday on business, and so I don't have personal experience. I wasn't there, otherwise I probably would have gone. Back in 1984, the then Conservative government, they wanted to get rid of the minimum grant, which was, the grant you received was based on your parents' income, and there was a minimum grant, which was the absolute minimum that everybody got, and your fees were paid for. And the Conservative government then proposed to get rid of the minimum grant and introduce tuition fees for some students. So this was the first time the idea had really been raised. And so, a bit like yesterday, the NUS organised a massive demonstration down in London. I don't think we had quite as many people. We had about 30,000 people. We all went down there in coaches from our universities around the country. We had slightly more people arrested. I mean, a bit like the one yesterday, there was a lot of coverage of student violence. And unlike yesterday, where I think it's currently 51 students were arrested, we had 180 students arrested. A bit like yesterday, most students were opposed to the idiots that were causing trouble. You know, it was actually because people felt really strongly about it that we all went down there. It wasn't the only campaigning we did. The thing that I think made the difference was we had a huge programme of getting students to get parents to write to their MP. And that was actually what really wound things up. That was when the government started to panic. So that might be something to think about for today's generation of student campaigners.
As you mentioned earlier, you narrowly missed out on a seat for Winchester. Were you disappointed by this, since prior to the election, this was a Liberal Democrat seat for 13 years?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't what I planned. Obviously, I was disappointed. And yeah, it hits you quite hard. I'd put an awful lot of my time and effort and money and years of my life into campaigning for it. So obviously, it's a disappointment. But the people decided, and you do your post-mortems. You wonder what you could have done differently. But at a certain point, you need to say, that's what's happened. I now need to get on with my life.
Many have claimed that the coalition has not been achieved or it is set out to since being placed in power. How do you view this?
Well, I mean, obviously it hasn't delivered the entire coalition agreement, because that's something that is designed to take the full 5 years of the Parliament. I think it's more been things that weren't in the coalition agreement that have caused trouble. It's been surprises.
Would you say they've been successful in possibly balancing the coalition?
It's very difficult to say. I mean, it's stable. I mean, that was one of the things they set out to do. I think the ministers inside the coalition, it is very stable. I don't know if it's balanced or not.
Some would say that the Liberal Democrats have folded under pressure from the Conservatives. After stating during their election campaign that they wish to abolish student fees, they have now stated their support for the raising of fees, even though they signed a petition started by the National Union for Students, stating that they would not support this bill. Where do you stand on the issue?
I signed that pledge. If I had been elected, I would have voted against the bill. I was looking back at newspaper reports back in 1984 of this demonstration, where I was quoted because I was the deputy president of my students' union. And I was completely against the principle of tuition fees then, and I've stayed completely against the principle of tuition fees ever since, and I'm not going to stop just because we went into coalition with the government.
Your next song is one that I'm sure everyone will remember and enjoy. It's the Black Eyed Peas with Where Is the Love. This is a bit of a different song choice. Why did you choose this?
It's quite an emotional one, in a way. It's strangely emotional. I after living in Vienna, I then lived in Germany for 3.5 years, and then I lived in Prague, and made some very good friends there, and including a German-American couple. He's German, she's American, who are very, very close friends, and they later moved back to the US, and we visited them. And I remember this friend, the husband of the couple, dancing with his son, which was just one of the most amazing, sort of beautiful things I'd ever seen. It was very, very sweet. And unfortunately, this friend is very, very ill at the moment. And so I happened to be thinking about him quite a lot. And I was thinking about this track, which was a very, very emotional moment. And because he's extremely unwell, I thought I'd add it to the list because it's a very happy memory.
That's lovely. We'll round off with your final song. It's Franz Ferdinand and The Dark of the Matinee. Why did you choose this song?
When I was living in Austria, I met my wife, Michaela. We got married later when we were living in Prague. And we listened to quite a lot of music together, but we don't have an hour song. And I was wrestling about this, and I was thinking, we once, and there's another whole story about, ended up at a Robbie Williams concert. And I thought, well, the classic thing given the scenario is somebody needs to be the first person to ask for Angels by Robbie Williams, but then I thought, no, that's too much of a cliche. And so what I did was I thought, well, she always has CDs in her car, and I just couldn't think what the fourth track was going to be. So I went out, and I climbed in the car, and I pressed play on the CD player. And it was Franz Ferdinand, and it was You're the Reason I'm Leaving. And I thought, well, I can't pick that. that would be a ridiculous track to finish on. So I had a look on the iPod and worked out which one I listened to most and which was my favourite track and which she listens to most and which is her favourite track. and it was The Dark of the Matinee by Franz Ferdinand, so that's what I picked.
That's about all we have time for. Thank you very much for coming in and talking to us. Tune in again for more Stairway to Heaven.